The ghost of Uijeongbu. The winter of 1951 did not simply bring snow to Uijeongbu. It brought a shroud. The city, once a bustling hub of life north of Seoul, was now a jagged skeleton picked clean by the vultures of war. The wind that swept through the skeletal remains of homes carried not the laughter of children, but the mournful whisper of loss. It was a cold that seeped deeper than bone, a cold of absolute silence where life used to be. In this landscape of frozen grief, a small figure moved with the quiet, determined purpose of a survivor. Her name was Park Min-ji, though no one had spoken it aloud in weeks. She was 6 years old, but her eyes held the ancient weariness of a soul that had witnessed the end of a world. Her world, a warm kitchen smelling of kimchi stew, the rough but gentle hand of her father, the lullaby of her mother, had vanished in a single deafening night of fire and thunder from the sky. Now she was a ghost haunting the ruins of her own memory. Dressed in layers of scavenged, ill-fitting rags, she moved through the rubble, her small hands digging through frozen earth and debris for anything edible. A frost-bitten potato, a discarded root. Hunger was a constant gnawing ache in her belly, second only to the hollow ache in her chest. Fear was her shadow, and the biting wind was her only companion. She had learned the hard lessons of this new world. Be silent, be invisible, and never, ever cry. Tears were a luxury, a warmth she could not afford to waste. She was a fragment of a family, a whisper of a village, a living testament to the collateral damage of a war that had forgotten its reasons but perfected its cruelty. The giant and the sparrow. One afternoon, as the pale sun bled weakly across the horizon, Minji's numb fingers closed around something hard and round in the frozen mud. A turnip. As she tried to pull it free, a shadow fell over her. It was vast, blotting out the meager light. She froze, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Slowly, she looked up. Towering over her was a giant clad in olive green, his face smudged with dirt and exhaustion. An American soldier. In his hands, he held a long black rifle, a tool of the same thunder that had stolen her family. Terror, cold and absolute, seized her. Sergeant John Sully O'Sullivan of the 24th Infantry Division had seen enough death to last a lifetime. He was tired, his soul chafed raw by the relentless fighting. When he saw the small, trembling girl who looked more like a bundle of rags than a child, something inside him shifted. He saw not an enemy, not a local, but a sparrow with a broken wing, shivering in a storm of humanity's making. He lowered himself to one knee, a gesture that was slow and deliberate, trying to make his large frame seem less threatening. He said something in his strange, deep language, but the words were meaningless noise. It was his eyes that spoke to her. They were blue, the color of a summer sky she could barely remember, and they were filled with a profound sadness. He reached into a pocket of his bulky coat and pulled out a small, rectangular object wrapped in colorful paper. A Hershey's bar. He held it out, his calloused, dirt-caked hand open and steady. Minji stared at the offering, then back at his face. For the first time in a long time, her fear was met not with violence or indifference, but with a quiet, unconditional offering of gentleness. Hesitantly, like a wild creature learning to trust, she reached out and took the chocolate. An oasis of tin and canvas. Sully couldn't leave her. It was a violation of protocol, a risk, but leaving her there felt like a violation of his own soul. He scooped her up. She weighed almost nothing, and carried her back to the makeshift U.S. Army camp. It was an ugly place of canvas tents, mud, and the constant smell of diesel and bitter coffee. But to Minji, it was a sanctuary. The other soldiers watched as Sully brought the girl into their world. Some were wary, others indifferent, but most saw in her the face of a sister, a daughter, or a neighbor they had left behind. They gave her a nickname, Shadow, because she followed Sully everywhere, a silent, watchful presence. He cleaned the grime from her face with a warm, damp cloth. A medic tended to the cuts on her hands and feet. She was given a corner of Sully's tent, a wool blanket that smelled of him, and a steady supply of sea rations, which she ate with a quiet, desperate intensity. In this oasis of tin and canvas, a routine formed. During the day, while Sully was on patrol or on duty, she would sit quietly, watching the strange activities of the camp. Sometimes she would draw in the dirt with a stick, images of a house with a smiling sun above it. In the evenings, Sully would sit with her. He didn't have much to offer, but he would take a small block of wood and with a well-worn pocket knife, begin to carve. As the wood chips fell away, the shape of a bird began to emerge. He was building a new memory for her, one small act of creation at a time, to stand against the overwhelming destruction. The silent goodbye. Their bond was forged in the silence between two languages. Sully would point to objects and say the English word slowly. Water. Blanket. Okay. The last one became their word. He would look at her, a question in his tired eyes, and she would nod, whispering the one English word she had truly mastered. Okay. She, in turn, taught him a single word of Korean. One evening, as he handed her a piece of bread, she looked at him and said, "Gomawo." Thank you. The word was a precious gift, and he held it in his heart. They didn't need a shared vocabulary to understand protection, to feel the warmth of companionship in a world frozen by hate. But the war, like time, moves only forward. The day came when a new unit arrived to relieve the 24th Infantry. Sully's tour was over. He was going home. The news settled in his gut like a lead weight. How could he leave her? The regulations were clear, the reality unbendable. He couldn't take her with him. To leave her was to return her to the unforgiving wilderness he had plucked her from. That night, he finished his carving. It was a small, smooth wooden bird, its wings half spread as if caught between flight and rest. The morning of his departure was cold and gray. The trucks rumbled, their engines a death knell for the small world they had built. He found her sitting by his pack, watching him with those ancient, knowing eyes. He knelt before her for the last time. He tried to speak, to explain, but the words wouldn't come. What could he say? I have to leave you now? Be strong? The phrases were hollow, meaningless insults to the bond they shared. Instead, he simply pressed the small wooden bird into her palm and closed her tiny fingers around it. He stood up and walked towards the waiting truck without looking back, because he knew if he did, he might not be able to leave. As he climbed aboard, he couldn't resist one last glance. Minji was standing exactly where he had left her, a solitary figure against the backdrop of the bleak camp. She was not crying out. She was not waving. She was simply standing still, the wooden bird clutched to her chest as silent tears streamed down her face, freezing on her cheeks. It was a goodbye without a single sound, yet it was the loudest, most heart-wrenching sound Sully had ever heard. The truck lurched forward, and the small sparrow of Uijeongbu, his silent shadow, grew smaller and smaller until she was swallowed by the gray morning mist.